Welcome to the About Sex podcast. I'm your host, Angela Skirtu, and you can find me at www.aboutsexpodcast.com, or you can also find me at www.therapistinstlouis.com. Today I have with me Dr. Tom Murray, co-owner of A Path to Wellness, and Dr. Tom says that for more than 20 years, he has been an advocate for cultural and sexual misfits. He says all too often people are forced into increasingly narrow definition of normal, and the mounting pressures contribute significantly to emotional and psychological distress. So, Dr. Tom, I'll let you explain a little more, but hey, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Angela, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, well, so tell us a little more about what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, so I've been in private practice for, now on 4 years. Prior to that, I was the University Counseling Center director and then went into private practice focusing near exclusively on sex therapy and couples therapy, with that emphasis on a sex-positive perspective, helping my clients experience a much more fulfilling, meaningful sex life, and owning really their own style of being a sexual person. You know, we're sexual beings 24/7. Our sexuality doesn't end just because we leave the house. And so helping people to really embrace their sexuality and integrate it as a part of their personhood.
I'm curious, who do you consider a sexual misfit?
Well, you know, those people who have been historically marginalized or oppressed because of their sexual interests. And we can think about, you know, people who are involved in the lifestyle, kink, BDSM, or it can be people who are queer folk, LGBTQI community. People who, again, have been pushed out to the margins, providing them for a space, with a space to examine their own sexuality without fear of judgment.
All right, now before we get into this next conversation, I just want to stop to give us a word from our new sponsors. So I am now working with a really cool company called Let's Get Checked. You can find them at trilgc.com/staykinky. What's really cool about this company actually is that they're doing testosterone testing for men and hormone checks for men and women. A lot of people are struggling with hormonal imbalances and reduced testosterone levels, which really can impact your sex life. And so more and more men and women are trying to test their hormone levels to see how they're doing. 1 in 4 men over 30 are actually low in testosterone. Symptoms you might want to look at include fatigue, erectile dysfunction, low sex drive, anxiety, brain fog, even having a hard time making decisions, which is basically most of my client population. Just teasing. But I mean, enough of you who come see me are actually really struggling with testosterone levels and your sex drive. So what's cool about this group is you can pick from either a male hormone test kit, a female hormone test kit, or an STD test kit. And what's really cool is they send it right to you in your home. You do what you need to do to take the test. And depending on what test you use, you'll either have to do a blood sample or a blood sample and a urine sample. And then you send it back and everything's completely confidential. And basically, they deliver it to your home, they collect your sample, they review your results for you. So depending on what happens with your test, they may provide a prescription in some cases. Usually it would only be for something like if they're treating STDs. If you do end up having something longer term like hormone therapy, then you'll likely be referred to a longer term provider. But at least you'll know where you stand. So it's really cool. Your results are available and they'll be reviewed by a physician. And then a nurse will contact you for a consultation over the phone. The Let's Get Checked laboratories are CLIA approved and everything is completely anonymous. So again, that website is trylgc.com/staykinky and use the coupon code STAYKINKY to get 20% off. Well, so quick, information for people listening. How would you, so you said the lifestyle, but not everybody listening knows what that means. So I'm curious if you would mind explaining to people, what is the lifestyle?
Well, lifestyle can really be different for different people. The BDSM lifestyle can be one example. The swinger lifestyle can be another example. But often it's an integrated part of their life that is outside of what may be more popularly thought of as traditional.
Mm-hmm. Do people find you when they're actually kind of struggling to integrate that, or are usually people finding you that they are integrated, they just needed a therapist who's kind of respectful and understanding of their needs?
Yeah, sometimes it can be a desire to experiment within a particular relationship. So maybe someone is in a committed partnership and wants to explore perhaps a BDSM community, and that triggers tremendous amount of anxiety in their partner, and that's has developed some tension there.
Mm-hmm.
Or within the poly community, for example, I've worked with thruples and quads around the dynamics and helping them to guiding them through identifying their own sets of values as it relates to the dynamic that they have, and hopefully making it work for their specific situation.
Yeah, that's one thing. So I obviously work in similar fields as a sex therapist as well, and it's always interesting because you have to kind of it's like people in these worlds are often paving their own paths. There's some examples out there of what they can embrace and cannot embrace, right? But it's their road and their journey to create. And sometimes there aren't a lot of examples of here's what a good situation looks like, or we're kind of learning through trial by fire in some ways. Are you noticing that too?
Yes, and of course, what is more readily available in the public consciousness are the examples where it didn't work. And it's so easy to assume that if those are the narratives that you hear, then that must reflect kind of a standard quality of this non-traditional way of living, right? In other words, it must be impossible to be engaged in a non-monogamous relationship or a poly relationship, and for it to be successful. And of course, we don't hear about the successes, but there are plenty of examples out there.
Yeah, absolutely. A silly joke I kind of tell my clients is just that nobody comes in saying, I feel great, here's my money. They come in when they're having problems, right? That's the reason we get hired. Right. So even for us, we can sometimes be, unless we actually have people in our lives that are showing that kind of example of positive, no, this can actually be a positive thing. We can even be skewed at times in terms of the clients we work with, because of course we're just going to see people who are struggling with it, not necessarily people are just happy-go-lucky all the time. And then also life is one that ebbs and flows. So there's times when things are better and times when things are worse too,
I think context can bring about surprising feelings for people. So someone who may not be primed to experiencing jealousy might find that, they are now experiencing jealousy because they've opened up their relationship and they never had that experience before. Mm-hmm. And so how they navigate that new feeling.
What are some of the things that you help people to do to navigate jealousy? Because I think that's a cool question of what does one do when you feel jealous in these situations?
Yeah, well, for a lot of people who experience jealousy, jealousy is that felt sense of needing to protect what you believe is already yours, right? And so there's an element of possessiveness that surrounds it. And how I help clients who experience jealousy is I look at some of the dynamics surrounding it. And the most common dynamic is a fear of no longer being perceived as special by one's partner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, kind of how am I going to be different if you're going to have these same experiences with other people, namely, if you're going to have sexual experiences with other people, then what makes our relationship special? And so that idea of specialness we take some time to really look at that. Also, it includes exposing the person to the concept of compersion, that ability to derive pleasure, if you will, from the knowing that their partner is experiencing enjoyment outside of the relationship, and so their experience of enjoyment one can derive their own personal enjoyment out of it.
Do you think that I'm on a few Facebook groups in this like arena of like poly and open relationships, and I'm curious if you think compersion is a means to help with jealousy, or is it a completely separate thing? Because there's a lot of debate in these groups around what role compersion plays.
Yeah, I think in general, compersion is just a wonderful component to relationships. And so to cultivate compersion, I think is in broadly speaking, is just a good value to when when monogamy is used as a cure for jealousy, that perpetuates this dynamic of a person being more like property rather than being a person. And so if one believes in the autonomy of the other, then one has to experience the anxiety that comes with that freedom. There's that tension between anxiety and freedom, and getting more comfortable with the uncertainty of life. And what monogamy can do is create an illusion that I call pseudo-certainty, right? This idea that the person will always be there. I talked about this just the other day on my Instagram, Dr. Tom Murray, that when we believe that when we expect our partner is going to be there tomorrow, that has an impact on how we care about our relationship today, and usually it decreases the motivation to care for the relationship today. And so when one is engaged in an open relationship, ethical non-monogamy, I think it necessitates a degree of intentionality that is often missing within the context of a monogamous relationship.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. As you were talking, I was thinking about how the concept of compersion could be valuable in all relationship types. Like I was thinking, picture your typical even monogamous couple. Like you should. So for those of you kind of listening in who don't know much about compersion is just the ability to feel joy from your partner's joy. Like, so one way I see couples do this is if their partner really likes something, like they're geeking out to something. I have a lot of geek culture clients, which I love. But so like, say they're geeking out about Star Wars and they're just talking about it and they're like totally in a buzz talking about it. You may know nothing about Star Wars, but they're can be a compersion or an excitement you feel watching them geek out about that situation, right? And so that's an example, even in a non-monogamous or in a monogamous. Well, now I'm just missing all those words. Monogamous, non-monogamous, whatever. In a basic relationship, it's an example of how people can have compersion. But then in non-monogamous relationships, people are attempting to have a type of compersion for the fact that their partner is going on a date with someone else and they're cultivating a love relationship or feeling connected to somebody new, and that there's an excitement when you can see your partner feel joy towards something, even if it's not yourself. And to your point, I think it is valuable for people to have that skill in a relationship, because it isn't about ownership. It isn't about owning another person or all of their time, but it is sometimes about even valuing their individuality and the things that matter to them, even if they don't necessarily matter to you personally. Now, do you think, as you were talking, you mentioned sometimes people don't value the relationship as much because it's like, well, I know you're going to be there tomorrow. Do you see non-monogamy as an antidote to that, or is it more that maybe people can learn from non-monogamous concepts to keep cultivating that sense of working for the relationship?
Yeah, as I've over the years grown as a therapist and as a sex therapist, I've basically landed on this idea that there's no one way of relating that's better than any other way. Mm-hmm. But each way brings with it its own set of pros and cons. And it becomes really a conversation around which set of benefits and liabilities, if you will, are you willing to live with?
How financial of you, benefits and liabilities.
For example, there's this concept called moral hazard. And moral hazard is essentially this economic finding that people are less likely to take care of things when they believe those things will be handled by someone else. So, for example, people who have health insurance may take more risks with their health than someone who doesn't have health insurance. Or renters may take less care of their house or apartment, knowing that there's someone who owns the property. And for a lot of people within monogamous relationships, particularly those who are married, what happens is that they bank on this marriage license as being the bind that's keeping them together. And therefore, they can easily put their relationship on autopilot and start to, they attend less to the relationship. And after so long, one person may start to feel checked out, and it may even come to the other saying, I'm done. And that person then, is oblivious because they've been on autopilot this whole time. And so I think, particularly within monogamy, that idea of attending to the relationship, actively attending to the relationship through communicating, where when one's in a non-monogamous relationship or in the BDSM dynamic, communication is just so imperative, right? And so, yes, absolutely. I think those who want to have monogamy can find very helpful skills from the non-monogamy kink BDSM community.
I'm curious, you brought up BDSM and kink. So what challenges seem to arise with the clients that you work with in the BDSM and kink community?
For the most part, I would say that it's the discomfort that one's interests have on the partner. So, for example, this was years ago, but I was fairly new as a sex therapist, and it was the day that I realized I have chosen the right profession. And on the same day, I had a couple come in, and the one spouse loved sitting around in soiled diapers. And that's how this person derived sexual pleasure. And their spouse was in the medical profession and just couldn't understand why someone would find pleasure in that. And found it, quite frankly, repulsive. And so a lot of the work was looking at autonomy and honoring that choice, while at the same time reconciling that one can be, one can be entitled to their own disinterest or their own reactions to things that one's partner does. About a few hours after that couple session, I had another client come in, and they were seeing me because their particular interest was smearing feces on their chest, and that was something that really turned them on. And so having those experiences back to back, it was the moment that I was like, yes, this is exactly why I got into this profession. And primarily because these are what could be very embarrassing experiences to share with other people. There's such a potential for judgment and shame and what have you, and to again cultivating a space where these individuals and couples can come in and just share these parts of themselves. To have that space is just a real treasure for me.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. What's interesting is you were talking, it reminded me of the theme you mentioned earlier, which is just that individuality. Something I repeatedly kind of tell my clients is that there's the couple sexual relationship, but you can have your own individual sexual relationship, and that I think sometimes in relationships, people feel like they have to share everything. Like everything. Yeah. You have to share everything sexually. You have to share all the same sexual desires. And what it really does is limit people from their own individual sexual relationships. And so some of that work is teaching people that it's okay to have your own space. Like you said, it was okay for her to not like it. It was okay for him to like it, and that there can be a space for him to act out his desires, but in a way that doesn't impact the relationship. And I think that's a really hard concept for some couples to wrap their mind around, that I can have my own sex life that doesn't include you, because it kind of goes back to that possessiveness, that ownership of no, this is ours and you don't have, I don't want to be abrasive with it, but it's you don't have a right to it. That's how it sometimes feels in certain relationships, that you don't have a right to have your own private sex life to some degree. What are your thoughts about that?
I think you're spot on. There are a lot of people who are just offended that their partner would masturbate.
Oh yeah.
Why would you want to masturbate? Why would you need to masturbate if you knew I was available? Why didn't you come to me to say you had any sexual interest or desire, as if masturbation was a substitute for sex. Mm-hmm. And of course, masturbation is just different. And so, there can be religious upbringings that inform those sets of beliefs. or familial or just general cultural rules, if you will. But that idea of honoring each other's as separate sexual beings that has mystery. That's the component, right? Is that all too often the mystery of the other is kind of filled, or what am I trying to say? The mystery just evaporates, and then the couple loses that spark. Esther Perel, who's a sex therapist, couples therapist, many people may have heard of, talks about, fire needs air. So there has to be space between partners. There has to be some separation between partners to feed the flames of desire. I'll often ask couples too, whether, do they feel comfortable masturbating in front of the other? And I generally find that those couples who are individuals who feel comfortable masturbating in front of another sexual partner tend to report much more satisfying sex lives in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when as you talked, I kept thinking back to compersion. And so people who seem to do well with this masturbation in their relationships, do have a level of compersion when they think about their partner masturbating, for example. When you talk to them and you say, oh, what do you think about, the fact that your partner masturbates? They'll have this idea of, well, that's sexy. I wonder what they're thinking about. That sounds cool. It's a compersion. They're taking joy and pleasure from their partner's pleasure. Whereas the people who really struggle with it seem to have a feeling like that was a moment stolen in some way. Like there's a thievery going on. Like you could have had sex with me, but you didn't. And I've seen this in the person who's masturbating too. So for a partner who I had to masturbate instead of us having sex. I call it resentful masturbating, where they essentially, they're doing it, but they are angry about the fact that they are doing it instead of with each other. And I'm like, and I have to reteach people how to masturbate. I'm like, this is not a good plan.
Yeah. The other thing that's coming up for me, just in hearing you describe that, is, again, I'm of the persuasion that what's forgotten among people who commit to monogamy is that they forget that monogamy, and this is true, of course, with all other ways of relating, but I'll stick with monogamy. Monogamy carries with it a certain set of rights and responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And broadly speaking, the right is we get to use each other's bodies in ways that other people don't have the same right to use our bodies. Right? So that's the right or privilege, you might use that word, that we extend the other access to our bodies in ways that other people don't have the same level of access. The responsibility, and this is the piece that is often forgotten, the responsibility is that I am obligated, really, to be attentive to your sexual needs, all the while reserving the right to say no, because it is my ability to say no to sex that gives yes its meaning. So that idea of I have to be attentive, I have to be interested, I have to be curious about your sexual needs, because we have removed from the equation the freedom to go down the street. And what I find all too often is in these sexless marriages, which we define as sex less than once a month, there is a lack of curiosity, a lack of communicating with one another about their sexual needs. And sometimes I'll ask those couples, I'll say, what's the definition of monogamy? And they'll arrive at, well, sex with one person. And I'll be like, yeah, that's exactly right. Monogamy is sex with one person. Sex with one person. So if you're not having sex, and monogamy is sex with one person, then you mustn't be monogamous. You must be something else. I don't know what that something else is. And of course, I'm broadly defining sex. I'm not just talking about penetration. Mm-hmm. But that idea of how that couple spends time with each other in ways that are unique, that feel sexually fulfilling in whatever ways they define that. That loss of interest in the others is a common theme in those couples who end up having sexless relationships.
Well, that complacency grows over time, and honestly, it's very much linked to obligatory sex, right? Like this feeling that you have to do this, that I'm the person who has to be responsible for all these things. You know, I hear that theme a lot with my clients, just this sense of, I want to do this. I don't want to feel like I have to do this to do some sort of, what do they call it? Maintenance sex is what I hear. Which, I mean, it's hard because, I work with all kinds of clients, right? And many of my clients do wish to remain monogamous to some degree, right? And so there's some version of how are we working at our sex life and putting effort into it. But to your point, there needs to be this sense of, I have a choice in this. I'm doing this because I want to, not because I have to. And there's got to be something in it for me, And I think when people feel like that sense of just, I'm obliged to do this, I just have to get this done, or this person's going to get mad, or we haven't hit our quota, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It's tiring.
And that obligation, I'm of the belief, again, that we often talk about being entitled to love.
Yeah, I hate entitlement for some reason. Fuck entitlement.
Yeah. When that makes love obligatory. Mm-hmm. Right. And that kind of love is soulless. At the same time, I've found couples who talk about how they gift sex to their partner at times. Mm-hmm. So there may not be a total wanting, in the sense that there isn't this strong desire, and yet they can gift sex to their partner, and in that process, in that gifting, they might find that the want or the desire gets started, that stoking that fire, and so that desire, that want kind of kicks in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely seen that too. What's interesting about the idea of sex as a gift, there's a lot of things interesting about it, but I think it's something that people do when they're in long-term relationships as well, because the natural desire that people have in the beginning just seems to die some. But I was also curious if you saw, I was thinking about asexual clients. I don't know to what degree you work with clients who are on the asexual spectrum, but I could imagine them using that particular idea, because it's like, an asexual person really just struggles to feel any form of desire naturally. So it's almost like a choice for them to I'm going to engage sexually, but it's not from any sort of hormonal interest or, longing in the sort of way that some people might feel desire. And so I could totally imagine using that gift idea in an asexual relationship. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's certainly a phenomenon. There are certainly people who don't experience desire. It's just is not an area that I do much work in. Most of the clients who come and see me come because they've lost that sense of desire and they want to, get the spark back.
I gotcha. Well, so there's something that you did put on your questionnaire that I want to ask you about. You put something about highly sensitive persons. So I'm kind of curious what that concept is and how it relates to what you do.
Yes. Highly sensitive persons is a temperament, just like introversion, extroversion. And about 20% of the population are highly sensitive. And some of the core characteristics of highly sensitive people are those who think very deeply. So there's this depth thinking. They tend to also experience degrees of over-arousability. So, too much of a sound, too much of a smell, when too many demands are placed on them at once, they may feel overwhelmed. And then emotional intensity, they feel things deeply. And then the last is sensory sensitivity. They tend to pick up things that other people might miss. So they have a very keen sense of awareness of what's going on around them. And I have worked extensively with highly sensitive persons. I'm being an HSP myself. And for your listeners, if they're interested in taking an assessment, a free assessment, and to determine if they're HSPs, they can do that at hsperson.com. And that's the website of Dr. Elaine Aaron, who is really the foremost researcher on the highly sensitive person temperament. And so working with that population has been very helpful when it comes to relationships, in part because HSPs may feel, for example, often fatigued because they've spent a lot of time in a highly chaotic environment, and so they may find that they just lack energy to be intimate or energy to engage in more conversation, that they prize the time to be alone so that they can recharge. About 75% of highly sensitive people are also introverts. And so there's that overlap, although one can certainly be an extrovert and be highly sensitive. And I generally find that the great majority of clients who use psychotherapy services, they tend to be a highly sensitive person. But given that 80% of the world aren't highly sensitive, it can be easy for partners or even clinicians to pathologize some of the qualities of the highly sensitive person, when in fact I see that temperament more like a superpower than certainly a form of pathology.
I gotcha. So, when you're working with somebody who struggles in this area, or superpowers in that area, as you said, what are some of the things that you have to help couples kind of navigate?
So the real first step for me is to educate them around this temperament, and then help them to see that how it shows up in the relationship no longer has to be taken personally. So, for example, perhaps a partner is fine going to a party, but doesn't want to spend all night at the party. that they find it particularly draining. And so if one is with a non-HSP partner, they can just understand that it isn't because the partner is a killjoy, but rather that is one way that they're taking care of themselves. Or if a partner, the HSP partner, needs to turn off the radio in the car while their partner is talking to them in order to be able to focus on what the partner is saying, because it's just too much stimulation going on at once. And so that educating the individual with HSP, but also the partner about how those characteristics show up, again, can be different for different people. My HSP shows up much more as in sound, where others, it might be other forms of stimulation. I often share a story about how I was in a long-term relationship with someone, and the pitch of their voice at times, not all the time, but at times, would just be so grating. And it had zero to do with what the person was saying. For as far as I know, they might have just had some allergy, and it just changed very subtly the pitch of their voice. And I just found it incredibly overwhelming.
I see. So it's making people aware of how that's impacting their partner, so that instead of them taking it personally, they can see it as, oh, okay, this is how they're managing essentially these sensitivities, so to speak.
Yeah. And again, kind of on a similar level as left-handed persons, right? They have to live in a right-handed dominant society, and HSPs are very, very much the same. We do live in a very, I would say overly stimulated environment, and self-regulation and learning how to be optimally aroused. So not under-aroused or over-aroused, but that for a lot of HSPs, that's a very narrow margin. And so there's a great deal of effort highly sensitive persons have to spend in trying to ensure that they stay in that optimal degree of arousal.
It's really interesting. Well, Dr. Tom, I just wanted to thank you. We're actually towards the end of the podcast, so I did want to thank you for coming on the show. And I guess I wanted to ask you to share with our listeners how people can find you if they want your help.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so they can go to drtommurray.com or Path to Wellness, and I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Tom Murray.
All right, great. And of course, you guys have been listening to the About Sex podcast, and I'm your host, Angela Skirtu. You can find me at www.therapistinstlouis.com, or you can find this podcast at www.aboutsexpodcast.com. Thank you again for joining me, Dr. Tom.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you've been on the show. And for the rest of you, stay kinky, St. Louis.